Welcome. Today, soldier suicides. A massive new study reveals that while the suicide rates were doubling for those deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were nearly tripling for soldiers who were never deployed. Why? And what can be done? We'll hear some answers in a moment. In our public intellectual segment, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy, we'll discover where diabetes education appears to work well in church. Later in the hour, we'll learn about something called supply chain mapping. There's a new socially networked way to track the myriad manufacturers needed to bring a single product to market. Important to know if you want to stay in business or avoid paying slave wages. Also today, we'll meet some members of GeoNYC, the programmers who map the life of the city with so many useful apps about food, money, transit, and more. First, though, soldier suicides. Poring over the records of nearly 1 million soldiers, the Army and National Institutes of Health have already smashed a few myths about what drives soldiers to take their own lives. Joining us via Skype, Michael Schoenbaum, Senior Advisor for Mental Health at the National Institute of Mental Health and a principal collaborator on the Army study. And in our studio, Paul Rycoff, founder of the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Last week, Paul was testifying before Congress on just this. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for having me.
Michael Schoenbaum, were there a couple of fundamental questions that you were trying to answer with this study?
Well, there's one big question that we're trying to answer, which is how to help the Army reverse this increase that has occurred really since 2004 in the rate of suicides in its personnel. I should say the research that you are referring to was published in JAMA Psychiatry about a week ago. That represents the first published findings from this research. The study itself is ongoing, and we regard those findings truly as a down payment, not as the final, but as the first products of this major effort.
So let's talk about that down payment for a minute, because some of the viewers may have seen or heard about these findings, and then we'll broaden out to the bigger picture with both of you. But it's been in the press that people, as I said in the introduction, not just those who were deployed, but people who were in the Army but not deployed are taking their lives at a faster rate than in the past, and sometimes at a faster rate if they were not on the front. Is that an accurate representation, first of all, by the media of what was found, or a piece of what was found?
Well, it's close. The details are complex, and principally because suicide is a complex phenomenon. The Army came to the National Institute of Mental Health in 2008 originally. And in 2008, what the Secretary of the Army at that time, Pete Guerin, reported to us was that the suicide rate in active duty soldiers had doubled since 2004. The Army had theories about what might be driving this, and the demands associated with sending soldiers to 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was obviously one of the things at the top of the list. But their request to us, what we have set out with the Army to do together, is assemble data that lets us test theories and otherwise identify risk and protective factors for soldiers in such a way that the Army can take action. The first and perhaps most obvious theory for the rise in suicides, which actually continued from when the Secretary first came to us, the rate doubled from 2004 to 2008. It rose again in 2009, 10, 11, and 12. This last year was the first year in almost a decade where the suicide rate in the Army fell from the previous year. In any case, the most obvious explanation was the sort of war is hell explanation, that you send soldiers to battle, they experience the traumas of war, and as a consequence, bad things happen to them. And indeed, we did find during this period that soldiers who have deployed have a higher rate of suicide overall than soldiers who have never deployed. The perhaps surprising finding that you mentioned at the top was that that explanation is not enough. We looked also at the 40% of soldiers in the Army over our study period, which goes back to 2004. About 40% of soldiers had never been to war yet. Many of them went on to be deployed. But we look at those who had not ever been to war, and in those people, while the overall suicide risk was lower than for soldiers who've deployed or returned from deployment, the rise since 2004 in suicide risk is at least as high for soldiers who'd never deployed as for those who were currently or previously deployed.
So what's your best explanation based on the study so far as to why that's the case?
So I'll have to admit, and this may sound partially philosophical and partially eggheady, our mandate is not so much about why, it's more about who and when. So the most important thing from our perspective was to identify that the Army could not focus solely on soldiers during or after deployment. They needed also to focus on soldiers who've never been to war because their risk was also increasing rapidly. Now, if I had to speculate, it is the case that the entire period we're looking at, right back to 2004, the Army has been at war. And surely it is stressful to be a soldier in the Army while the Army is at war. So these 40% of soldiers are a mix of people who haven't been in the Army long enough to deploy. They may be nervous because they anticipate getting sent to war. Some of them were candidates for deployment, but for whatever reason, either their health problems or some other issue, were left behind when their peers deployed. That may be a stress in its own right. It may also simply be that being a soldier at home, you're still surrounded by people who have returned from deployment, and the stresses of their experience may be rubbing off on you. In short, the message is that during this period, there have been many different stresses on the Army, and those stresses have had very wide-reaching effects on the force. And in fact, no single explanation is sufficient for understanding the rise in suicides that we've observed over this period.
So at this point, I want to bring Paul Rycoff into it. And to be clear, their study is about active duty personnel. You represent veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But I want to focus on the overall war is hell scenario. So if war is hell and the anticipation of going to war is also hell, there's having come back from the wars, when one might think that one breathes a sigh of relief because they're done with all that.
Right.
But it's not always the case.
That's right. I mean, what we know in our work is that coming home can be hell too. And I think this study is groundbreaking in that it gives us a glimpse inside the active duty Army. But keeping in mind that that's just the active duty Army, this is maybe 1 million or so folks. About 2.5 million people have served in Iraq and Afghanistan since 9/11. Then there are about 22 million veterans of all generation total. So this can give us a glimpse into the active duty, but what we see in our work is the real challenges begin when you leave the service. When you're discharged from the Army, when you leave that network and that camaraderie, and you hit Brooklyn or hit Queens, and you're trying to navigate your transition, and you're trying to navigate a pretty wide spectrum of available services. That's where our role is critical as a veterans organization, trying to help guide our members through that process. And it's a very difficult process. It's a very confusing process, and I think at the end of the day, what we see is a significant, serious suicide problem across the military veterans community. And I would argue, based off our data and our perspective, a growing problem, because this is just the tip of a larger iceberg, keeping in mind how many people have left the military since 9/11 and over the last 40 years.
And it seems to me that we've been hearing about vet suicide as well as active duty suicides more with respect to the Afghanistan and Iraq war personnel than we have in the past. So I wonder if you have a historical perspective. Was war hell in a different way during Vietnam or even during World War II or Korea that did not lead to as many suicides either during or, since you study vets, after?
We don't know. I think we know that when veterans come home, it's hard, and suicide has always been a problem since the dawn of man going to war. What we do have is better data, but I think Michael will tell you that our data is woefully incomplete. There is no national registry for veterans, so we don't have any idea how many have committed suicide or how many have died by a car accident or have cancer. So one of the things we've advocated for is a national registry that can help us track at least this generation of veterans, similar to how we do with Ground Zero first responders. Folks who went down to Ground Zero after 9/11, they can be tracked in a health registry over time, and we can find out what is the data that's really driving this. But what we do know is that there are too many veterans who are seeking help and they can't find it. In New York City, where IAVA is headquartered, we recently stood up a program called the Rapid Response Referral Program. If veterans are out there and they're having a hard time transitioning, they can reach out to us and we can help them. If they're suicidal, they should go to the Veterans Crisis Line. If they're in that crisis point, there is a very strong program in place that's really only been in place since I think 2008 that's providing support on a 24-hour basis. But if they're somewhere else in that transition period, we want to be there to help them navigate housing, employment, and all the other pieces that often can contribute to a person getting to that crisis point.
And Michael, let me follow up with you on basically that same question about the nature of these wars compared to past wars. Is there something about not knowing where that next improvised explosive device is going to come from out of nowhere while you're just driving down the street in your vehicle, as compared to, say, older style wars where at least you knew you were going to confront another army somewhere along the line? Or is that way too simplistic?
Well, so there are a lot of important points packed into that. I want to start by echoing the comment about the suicide being the tip of the iceberg. So suicide in active duty service members is one kind of tip of the iceberg. There are non-fatal suicide events. There are many, many, many people struggling with psychological health issues or other kinds of adjustment issues. The vast majority of those people will never attempt, let alone commit suicide, but that doesn't make their problems any less serious or any less worthy of attention. This is true in active duty military populations. It's absolutely true also in veterans populations. We should not measure ourselves solely by what we can observe in terms of suicide. That said, there are probably some differences in the nature of the current war. There was a lot of attention paid early in the war in Iraq, particularly, about how military medicine has improved and the hardware with which we equip our soldiers has improved to the point where there are service members surviving injuries now that they didn't used to survive. Some of those injuries take the form of traumatic brain injuries in particular. While the research that we published last week doesn't really yet address anything relating to traumatic brain injury, we do know from our own study and from a lot of other research that people who have experienced a traumatic brain injury are more susceptible to developing psychological health problems as well, have a harder time adjusting into military or civilian life, and also have a higher suicide risk. So in this one way that people are now fortunate to survive a kind of injury that in previous wars they might not have survived, there may be these kind of downstream unexpected consequences about suicide. The broader point, though, is exactly right, which is that we don't actually have a good way of assessing how the patterns associated with the current conflict compared to previous years.
Because there aren't
There's no
historical
benchmark.
registries and
Yeah.
things
Well,
like that. So Paul, let me come back to you on what he just raised about the survival rates,
Yeah.
right? Because of better interventions and prosthetics and things like that, people who would have died of the same injuries in past wars have survived Iraq and Afghanistan at a faster rate.
That's absolutely right.
But they've come home with serious physical problems
Absolutely.
that, of course, translate for many people into serious emotional problems.
I mean, we have
that's a veterans issue.
We have members who've lost 3 limbs, who have had 60 surgeries on their face after being burned. I mean, these are people that would have died in Vietnam. They would have died in the Gulf War, most likely. What is, I think, unique about this generation is the unprecedented pace, the unprecedented stress, and the fact that we keep sending them back over and over again. In Vietnam, you did your 2 years, and unless you wanted to extend, you came back and you were done with the war. Now, if you come back, you're probably still in the National Guard or Reserve, you may be in the Individual Ready Reserve, and there's a tremendous kind of cloud of potential deployment that looms over all of us. I mean, I got out in 2004 and never knew if the Army National Guard was going to call me back or not. And I think that's something we can't really quantify, but is new. Also, the role of women, for example. About 15% of our membership is made up of women. That's something the VA has never had to handle before. Suicide prevention resources have never had to handle that kind of scope of women being involved. So there are new challenges, but at the end of the day, what we continue to see is there's an issue of stigma, there's an issue of access, there's an issue of quality of care, and then continuity of care. So many of our members are often bumping around between the VA, maybe a local hospital, maybe a private physician, and we need to provide them with consistent, high-quality care so that when they do step forward and ask for help, that we can guarantee it. And
don't people go into the military with a higher rate of underlying PTSD, even though we think of that as a military-generated condition?
I don't know.
Other kinds of predispositions toward this?
I don't know if it's higher. Michael could probably jump in on that one. What I do know is that they're pre-screened for psychiatric disorders.
Which
so theoretically,
would make you think that it would be lower.
Right. So it's never apples to apples, right? It is apples to oranges. But any rate of suicide in a conflict zone should be especially troublesome. I mean, we have members who've been going back, 8, 9, 10 times. That is unprecedented. The psychological and family demands we're putting on these people are really unprecedented.
And Michael, you have some data on this, right?
Well, we have data on many of the pieces you all were just discussing. Let me mention first the issue of multiple deployments. So our objective is, in some cases, the Army started with hypotheses or other people have voiced hypotheses, ideas about what might be driving the suicide rate up. And we are assembling data that allow us to look at some of those ideas. And one of them, actually commonly made, is the multiple deployments hypothesis, that one of the drivers, maybe some people even say the principal driver of this increase in suicide over the last decade has been that more and more soldiers have not just been deployed, but have been deployed more and more times. And it's surely true for the individual service member that being deployed again, a second, third, fourth, fifth time, it is certainly stressful. But our data suggests that the patterns here are actually kind of complex. So anyone who enlists in the Army during a time of war can reasonably expect to be deployed. It's not that that first deployment is a random event, but more or less everybody's a candidate for the first deployment. And we do observe that that first deployment increases people's suicide risk significantly, and the risk never goes back down to the pre-deployment rate after people return from that first deployment.
Very briefly, what's the next big question you're going to try to answer, since you told us this is a big ongoing study?
Well, we've identified in this initial research, we've kind of busted some myths about what it isn't. It's not only deployment. It isn't multiple deployments, because the people who deploy multiple times have selected themselves to be relatively hardy. It isn't entry waivers. Our objective now is to assemble data in such a way as to help the Army figure out what it is, and in particular, how the Army can look at their population of 600,000 soldiers and find 600 or 6,000 at a point in time who really need attention, so that they can focus resources based on the data on the people who need the most help. You can't deliver effective services to an entire population of 600,000 people distributed all over the world. The vast majority of those people have almost no suicide risk. But you need to be able to find needles in this big haystack. And our objective, and we are working very intensively with the Army on this and have made some success, is to help the Army build smaller haystacks with more needles.
And with 1 million people in the study, that's a lot of potential small, medium, and large haystacks that you can build to find good patterns that might help people. So thank you very, very much for your work and for coming on with us. And Paul Rycoff, finish up in just a few seconds by telling people where they should go if they are seeking help.
Well, if you're in immediate crisis, reach out to the Veterans Crisis Line. You can find them online. You can text them. It's an important program. If you're struggling through transition, go to iava.org. And I would just end with this. That's a great summary of how this is the Army's challenge, but we need to remember this is everyone's challenge. This is New York City's challenge. This is the tri-state area's challenge. We need Mayor de Blasio. We need the governor. We need everybody in philanthropy in the business section to consider this a community problem. It's not just the Army's challenge. It's all of our responsibility to support these men and women of all generations who are coming home to our area and need our support.
Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, our public intellectual segment, where diabetes education appears to work in church. Time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. If nothing changes with the diabetes epidemic, it's estimated that 1/3 of Americans could have the most common type, type 2, by 2050. Already about 9% of New Yorkers have the disease. Of all the ways to take on the problem, promoting exercise, teaching about healthy habits in schools, banning large sodas, here's one avenue you may not be aware of: church. Since 2001, one campaign has been tackling diabetes through a coalition of churches in the Bronx and Harlem. The public health outreach is being done by the Institute for Family Health, a large community health center. Has the education campaign worked? Well, a study published in the journal Diabetes Educator and undertaken by the New York Academy of Medicine says yes, that faith-based health outreach is working. Here to explain, Linda Weiss, Director of the Center for Evaluation and Applied Research at the New York Academy of Medicine. Welcome to our program. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
What was the basic research question here? What were you trying to answer?
Well, the Bronx Health Reach, the intervention that, the broader intervention that, that we studied addresses disparities related to diabetes and heart disease focusing on the Bronx and focusing on African American and Latinos primarily. And so the Bronx Health Reach works at multiple levels: policy level, organizational level, individual level. The study that was published in the Diabetes Educator looks at one of their individual level interventions. They worked in church. The program works in 40-some churches, but this article is based on 15 churches where an intervention called Fine, Fit, and Fabulous was implemented. And what we were looking at was the impact over 12 weeks in terms of increase of knowledge, behavior change, and weight loss among participants.
And this is not people who already have type 2 diabetes, but people considered at risk?
This intervention was open. You could have diabetes, you could be at risk, you could actually be at very low risk. Most of them were at risk. They didn't have diabetes and they weren't at low risk. They were overweight, which puts you at risk.
And so that's the population, who the individuals were, who these interventions were aimed at. And as a social science research project, what were you measuring?
We measured, well, we wanted to measure what kind of consistent with the literature, consistent with knowledge that people need to reduce their risk of diabetes, many people need to lose weight. To lose weight, you need to eat less. You need to eat different kinds of food, so less fast food, more fruit and vegetables, drink water rather than soft drinks. You have to understand portion size. So we were looking at change in knowledge along all those areas, as well as behavior change, as well as, again, did people lose weight? Because ultimately that's key.
So were you comparing how messages about these things delivered in church change people's behavior along those lines versus messages delivered on the same topics in other contexts?
In this study, we were not doing that. We were doing a kind of pre-post. So we looked at people in the beginning, what did they know, what was their behavior like, and then at the end of the intervention, did it change? And we did see change. I and many of my colleagues that work on this, we are aware of the, kind of the broader field around that, so we can make those comparisons, but that was not part of this.
Based on background knowledge.
Yeah.
And so make some for us. Why church?
Church is really where a lot of people are. So people, and the churches that were involved in Bronx Health Reach or are involved, we did surveys of congregants on Sunday morning and asked them how often do they come, how long have they been coming, and it was really surprising to us. Many people come to church many times a week. They've come to the same church for years and years. Even people who move out of a community, they tend to come back. So it's a place where people like to come. They come often. We also, besides the surveys included in this paper, in the just the general survey that we did ask about weight, and there's very high levels of obesity. So it seemed like a population just, waiting for this.
And what levels of behavior change did you measure?
Well, we did a survey at the beginning and then at the end, and we asked questions about understanding of portion size, understanding of, and doing physical activity, and we did see statistically significant changes in our variables of interest. So that was all good. Just to go back to your question about comparing this intervention to other interventions, I think most people in public health in this field recognize the need for, the problem is so big, you need multiple ways of approaching it. So you need your church-based programs, you might need YMCA-based programs, you might need clinic-based programs. Any one won't capture everybody, and so you need a multi-pronged approach,
right.
Basically.
Could you compare to other kinds of community centers?
So yeah, we actually did an evaluation of a program that was implemented in YMCA's, and somewhat similar in structure, 16 weeks rather than 12 weeks, but the same idea of changing dietary behavior, changing physical activity. And the weight loss in that program was very good. The participants tend to be middle-class white people. So in terms of engaging this very high-risk population, it seemed to be missing from that intervention.
So is it community that matters to the success of this? Is it faith? Can you tease those things out?
I can't tease them out scientifically, but I think what we felt, and both from the surveys and then we did interviews as well, is that it's both of those things. The church creates a community of support. So people, they're at an event, somebody knows they're in this intervention, they say, well, why are you eating that cake? You're trying to lose weight. So there is this sense of community and support that exists in a church. But the other thing is, in this intervention, they did incorporate a lot of spiritual messages, and people felt that was important to relate health behaviors to spirituality.
Give me an example of that. What's a spiritual message on diabetes risk reduction?
Well, very kind of broadly, it's kind of your body as a temple kind of thing, and you're respecting God by treating your body well. So
You have a follow-up study in mind?
we've done a few different studies on diabetes prevention programs. So our follow-up study, we do have one in mind. It's really, besides people of color being missing from the YMCA program, who's missing from almost all of them are men. So that's our
Women go to
hopeful-
church.
Women go to church, but even outside of church, women go to health promotion programs, and men tend not to. So that's,
And
but
do you
their
want
risk is very high.
the city to do more faith-based programs? Is that the right way to put it, for the maximum public health outcome?
Well, again, I think programs have to be in multiple venues to attract different audiences. So when you're focusing on men, faith-based is not necessarily ideal. It's possible.
Go to the ball game.
Yeah, go to the ball game. But I would say that faith-based programming, and this is not the first or the only faith-based program, I think the evidence shows, not only ours, but other studies, that they're effective across different issues, not just diabetes, but HIV, different topics.
Well, very interesting. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
It's almost a year since the tragedy in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where the garment factory at Rana Plaza collapsed, leaving more than 1,100 people dead and 2,500 injured. As a result, 156 retailers and brands have signed an agreement promising more safety inspections in Bangladesh. But must inhumane conditions only come to light after something goes terribly wrong? Part of the problem is getting information about who is supplying the raw materials and labor for the products we buy. It's not always easy for consumers, activists, or businesses themselves, because nowadays the supply chains that feed manufacturing are complex, often involving scores of companies across the globe. A new website called SourceMap.com is one attempt to clear up this problem. The site allows users to create supply chain maps online for everyone to see. Joining us, SourceMap CEO Leonardo Bonanni. Welcome to our program.
Thanks for having me.
And before we show some to our viewers, explain more. What is a source map?
Well, products today take the most complex form and they travel the world before they get to us. So it's not uncommon for everyday goods to have hundreds of thousands of suppliers putting them together. When you or I buy a product, we have very little information on where it comes from, and we can't really vote with our dollar about the social or the environmental impact. So the goal of SourceMap was to bring transparency to supply chains for the benefit of consumers so that we could all play a part in making more sustainable choices.
And it's not just the businesses revealing this all on their own. Oh, these 32 different suppliers all contribute to making that pair of jeans you're going to buy at the X chain store. You're rooting this out, activist groups are rooting these out, consumers, customers are being asked to do some individual research?
That's right. Supply chains are so big that it's impossible for a company to track down every single raw material. And so SourceMap was actually invented as a crowdsourcing platform, so a way for many, many millions of people to contribute those bits and pieces that add up to the giant global network.
So we're going to show a video first that doesn't have any sound. And let's roll that, and you're going to tell us what we're looking at here.
Oh, sure. This is actually the first source map that was ever created. It tells the story of how computers come together, basically microchips. And it gives you some insight into the number of countries and materials that go into one of the most common products that we all have today. You can actually click around on sourcemap.com, explore thousands of different supply chains, and in some cases zoom in and see the exact locations where the factories are located. This is actually the Foxconn factory outside of Shenzhen, where all the iPads in the world are made. And in some cases, you can even see the mines where the raw materials come from. This map was both a a test, a demo, and a provocation. Because when we showed this to companies, they realized they had never seen this kind of information about their own supply chains, and they started asking us to help them figure it out. One of the low-hanging fruits of supply chain mapping is once you know where things come from, you can measure their impact and their true cost, their environmental, their social, and their financial cost. This is an example of mapping two products, an organic product shipped from far away, Brazil, and a conventionally grown product shipped from Mexico. And it makes the point that shipping doesn't always make a difference. Buying local is a great thing to do, but sometimes buying more ethically or sustainably sourced products from farther away is actually better for the world. And this shows also to our clients, our customers in manufacturing companies, that until you've mapped out your supply chain, you might be wasting a lot of fuel or a lot of resources in sourcing what you thought was the simplest way.
Boy, there's so much in there. So you're telling consumers on the one hand that if they've accepted the premise of the locavore movement, that the closer something comes from, the more environmentally sound it is. It's not always the case. Something that's maybe grown organically or that takes a non-environmental condition into account, like labor conditions, may actually be better for the world for you to buy than something that comes from closer, right? So that's one complication.
That's right.
And another is you're saying that some businesses may learn from this that they're not doing things in the most efficient way, whether or not they're concerned about slave wages and deadly labor conditions.
I mean, that's right. If you don't know where your supply chain is, you don't really know how your business is doing. I mean, this happened, we founded our company a month after the disaster in Japan, the tsunami and then the Fukushima disaster. What happened then was the entire auto industry discovered that they had been dependent on factories in Japan in areas where there had been destruction. How can it be that major corporations, sourcing from major Japanese corporations, don't have the visibility into their sourcing to the point that when a storm hits, it takes weeks or months before their factories are back online? And that's exactly what we're trying to solve.
You said the Foxconn iPad factory was the original example in that video. Did you confront Apple with this? And if so, what was the response?
Apple's actually been quite forthcoming with their supplier list. And this mapping system confronted all the companies back in 2009 when it was invented at the Media Lab at MIT, and many stepped up to the call. Intel was actually the first company to disclose all of its suppliers. Apple followed suit in 2009. Now we see a number of apparel manufacturers, Nike, for example, publishing their supplier list. So it's actually taken hold.
So let's see an example of a company that has put their source map up themselves, and this is Chiquita, who we know from Chiquita bananas.
That's right. A number of companies joined our website early on and were quite transparent about their supply chains because they had put a lot of work into building up a supply chain from the roots. Not all companies actually work directly with farms. Chiquita is one example, and what you see here is the typical example of a end-to-end supply chain, what's called a farm-to-table. So you see plantations in Latin America, where the product is being transported to warehouses in the US and then to customers in Europe and the Middle East. And this is one of the first examples of a supply chain visualization published by a company showing exactly how goods are getting to market, and it was meant to reassure people that sustainable measures are being taken.
So what are we looking at here, for example? Like, they're not growing bananas in Ireland up there, are they? Or down there in Saudi Arabia at the lower right circle where the cursor is now?
That's right. You see there's a spectrum. You see the root, the sort of upstream, what it's called in supply chain terminology, is the farms, and those are in Latin America, and they're colored turquoise in this visualization. And then it travels to the pink warehouses, and finally the orange and the yellow are the customer locations. So you can really see a product from birth to death.
Can we get all this data by searching through government records, or is it not that simple?
No. Supply chains are one of the most complex things on earth. I call a supply chain a social network. You think of it as hundreds of thousands of people handing goods off from one to another across the world. And there is no jurisdiction over supply chains. Globalization has really fractured manufacturing globally, and so what you have to do is really engage all of the people along the way, the people who actually are part of the supply chain, and the local governments and the NGOs that watch over them.
And companies that would supply this to you voluntarily, like Chiquita in that case, are you confident that they're disclosing either complete or accurate information? Because wouldn't these sometimes be competitive secrets that they wouldn't want the other companies who grow bananas or do whatever it is that they do to know?
You know, we thought that was the case, and that's why we made SourceMap a crowdsourcing platform. We were pretty sure that companies do not want to disclose where they source products. Turns out, actually, if you want to know where Chiquita grows bananas, it's very easy to find out. There have been many books written about the topic. It's actually not a competitive advantage. The competitive advantage for all of our customers is the care that they've taken to add a lot of value to the products that they make. And so finding out what they're made of is not the main profit motive. Now, we know that a lot of companies don't do that, and especially upstream. There are many even criminal actors in supply chains that try to make money by dissimulating the source or by adulterating the product. And frankly, our customers all want to know. They think, just like you and me, that they have a right to know where their raw materials are coming from. And so the push is really coming from manufacturers into the upstream, into the mines and the farms and the factories in China to get more transparency.
Where have you really seen change as a result of this movement or process?
Well, I've always believed that the problem with supply chains is a lack of accountability. So even if every actor wants the best for the world, the fact that we don't know how our decisions play out means that we can't do anything about it. So what we've seen is these social networks grow and grow, and our best and most sort of ambitious project right now is with Mars Chocolate, and they've taken our social network and they've created a version that bridges between cocoa farmers in West Africa and the management at Mars Global. And so what you have there is a network that connects $1 a day wage earners in subsistence farms with management directly in real time. And the data is being exchanged every day through Android phones that are being used in the field. And so there, I think, is the biggest achievement we've done so far. It's not just the mapping, it's not just the transparency, it's a human connection that makes the decisions on one side of the world reflect in positive change on the other side of the world.
Let's take a look at one more example of a map, and this, I believe, is a crowdsourced one that pertains to Nokia.
That's right. We've seen a lot of students and NGOs now using this tool. It's a free tool, so they use it to measure the carbon footprint of products. In the absence of data, they go ahead and publish these. And I think actually if you click around on the bottom, you'll see somebody's gone to the trouble of measuring the energy footprint and the carbon footprint of a product. In the absence of data, this is a scientific method. The more people publish maps, the more people try to estimate the impact of products, the closer we will get to an accurate picture, even though right now we're still missing a lot of the raw data.
Do you make money in all this?
We do. SourceMap is a startup based in New York, and we sell a version of this tool to companies trying to get a handle on their extended supply chain. For a very reasonable cost, they can now talk to hundreds of thousands of companies in their extended network, get real-time data, and they're no longer victim to these kinds of interruptions that would happen when the Rana Plaza collapsed in Bangladesh or when the tsunami hit Japan. They want to be on top of their supply chain and be there before anything happens. Or, God forbid, something happens, they want to be the first to call the supplier and make sure everything's okay.
So they're seeing enough self-interest in this to pay you money rather than try to maintain the secrets, at least some companies, the companies that are buying your service, and hope that no activist outs their supply chain.
That's right. Business as usual is not working. Supply chains are breaking every day. You saw that last year with Hurricane Sandy in New York City. People acting as individual actors in supply chains does not make for a sustainable or resilient future. And that's why companies are coming to us.
Thank you very much for joining us. Good luck with it.
Thanks for having me.
And now that we've heard about mapping the entire world for supply chains, let's hear who's mapping New York City for, well, just about everything. Besides the subway map, the bus map, the neighborhood map, there are more obscure ones, such as the ever-useful city bike map. There's also the map showing the locations of bike accidents. All these maps are part of a wave of portable, interactive, infographic apps that are changing the way we see and use our city. Some are created by city agencies, many others created independently. The heart of the independent mapping movement is the meetup group GeoNYC. With us, two of the group's organizers, Alyssa Wright, Vice President of Civic Programs at Boundless, and Andrew Hill, Senior Scientist at Visuality. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Talk about your groups first. What's Visuality?
So Visuality is a company that's worked on environment and conservation issues for NGOs, scientists, a lot of different organizations. And then we got into making maps. I'd say 9 out of 10 projects we were working on had a map. And we thought if we made an open source tool that made creating beautiful maps online easier, that we could share that with a lot more people than our clients to start making their own maps. And so now we build a mapping software called CartoDB.
And boundless?
Boundless is an open source geospatial company. So what it does is it takes a lot of open source projects and brings them together into a complete open technology mapping stack. So we work a lot with kind of corporations, large governments that have big data sets, like TriMet MTA. The TriMet system runs on our infrastructure. A lot of USGS or Weather Service runs on our infrastructure. So we're working with like big mapping problems in an open source perspective.
And we'll talk about what happens at GeoNYC meetups and stuff like that. But why don't we just put up a few maps at first, and you can tell us what we're looking at here, some examples of how people are so creatively mapping different aspects of the city. So is this one that you immediately recognize?
Yeah, so this is a set of maps that were made for Sweeten.com. They were made by a couple GeoNYC members, Jeff Verzoko and Eric Brailsford, who actually, I think they had met before GeoNYC, but then they sort of rediscovered each other's skills and abilities at GeoNYC and decided to work on this client-based project together. And so what it is Department of Buildings had a data set of every building renovation that had happened over, I forget the time span, the last 10 years or so. And so they put together these maps so that you could explore them if you had your own building, home renovations that you wanted to do. You could see what the history in your neighborhood was like for building renovations, what people were paying, and the different companies, architects or building firms that were working on them. And so we actually wanted to highlight this one because it's a great example of bringing together open data visualization on a map, and beautiful interaction, which are all some of the common threads you see through GeoNYC and sort of the mapping movement right now.
Well, go ahead.
Sorry, another thing that I think is special for it being a GeoNYC project is that like magic that happens when you have people that are kind of interested in similar projects, interested in similar questions, coming together with like complementary skill sets, using like technologies that are represented like in our discussions to bring that kind of map into fruition.
So let's go right on to another example. If we've got one ready, let's see if we can bring it up. Red Hook Wi-Fi, broadband adoption. What are the colors?
So this map is actually from one of our authored by one of our sponsors for GeoNYC, the Open Technology Institute with the New America Foundation. And here, Georgia Bolin, as one of the leads, she presented on this map where it's a community engagement with the Red Hook, a Red Hook initiative that after Sandy, they started to look at where is broadband access in Red Hook. And through community engagement, identified that in a lot of the places that do not have very good broadband access are actually in the projects. And so what can the community do to start correcting, and addressing these problems, and the kind of power of mapping it, how that can influence policy decisions at a larger level.
Is green good on this map?
Green means yes, you have very good broadband subscriptions. The red, which was kind of the center for the projects, is where there's very little.
And has it been able to influence public policy when it's laid out visually like that? And I think this is a lot of the point. If the housing authority or city hall, maybe it's even some of the broadband companies, cable companies, Verizon, whatever, sees this, they'll go, oh my God, we are really underserving a population here. Has that happened?
Well, so it's actually really interesting with those maps, and we have some examples that we're going to show you in a bit that have those cases. But in this map in particular, it actually was about showing the people themselves that they were being underserved, so that they could come up with their own solution. And so that's what the whole point of that map was, and getting these people to then create their own broadband or their own internet solution in Red Hook, which is now happening.
So it's a lot about, that specific map is also about like community empowerment, right?
Yeah.
So to address issues, yeah.
Let's go back to the maps. Zeta Shapes. This is not Catherine Zeta-Jones
No.
shape, right?
Was
This
it
is
inspired by
something
that?
about
I don't think so.
Foursquare, which lets you register where, a location that you're at. So what are we looking at?
Right, so this one's a really interesting example of creating map data and maps themselves. We really thought it was particularly interesting because maps have always actually been an instrument of power. The people that draw the borders and share those borders with other people have the power of creating them.
As Vladimir Putin was telling us just the other day.
Exactly, yeah. And so what's really interesting with these maps is one of the developers at Foursquare started looking at what we call neighborhoods, especially in New York City, but the project actually is greater than that. But what we call neighborhoods in New York City and what those borders are, and started saying, well, actually, that's not what we really live by. What do we really live by as neighborhoods? So this is a crowdsourced way of getting those borders. And so on the left are the neighborhoods as told by the city, and on the right are the neighborhood borders as told by the people that actually live in them. And so they're doing this across the country, and I think he actually has some worldwide coverage now of what people actually call the places they live in.
And how could knowing this difference lead to some kind of quality of life improvement for somebody?
Well, he gives this really good example of when you search in Foursquare for where's pizza in Soho. And because of some different kinds of border lines and the way the algorithms are set up, you might end up finding pizza in, like, you know, Dumbo or somewhere, I don't know, East Village. But because of these sort of structures of and the crowdsourced borders that they're making, you get a much more accurate result for your searches. So
I have a
if
feeling
pizza
there's
is
something
quality of
more
life.
profound than knowing which neighborhood you're eating pizza in at the moment.
All right, that's fair. I think for me, the most profound contribution around this sort of project is that we have people that are making maps, and then we have like tools, like underlying tools that are fueling, that are put out for Foursquare to make better products and serve their customers better. But then I know of at least like 4 other projects that are also using that same like code base. And so that they can use those crowdsourced tools to start to begin to define like what are boundaries.
Cool, let's go on to another one. What is Mindwriter?
So this is an example of where you have, Mindwriter is coming from actually a project from the MIT Media Lab, who's now in a design studio here in New York.
And this is about bicyclists?
Yes, and so they have kind of tracking, I think, your brain waves as you're traveling around. It's a bike helmet that tracks your brain waves as you're traveling around
It's
New
a
York.
bike helmet that tracks your brain waves?
And that is her, a happy user and the author of the project with the helmet. And so this is an area where you're driving into, or you're riding into kind of a heavy traffic area, and is measuring kind of like the stress of what that looks like.
So it doesn't warn you that you're riding into heavy traffic now,
No.
but it monitors what's going on in your brain. And again, to what end?
What I really like about those maps is something that somebody that I know really well says all the time is everything happens someplace, right? And that is true with the way you live your own life. And so more and more people are getting interested in how they are reacting and how they're acting in the places they live and the places that they go. And so you can see a lot of these technology companies now making it possible to collect that information all the way as deep as your brain waves, and that's pretty interesting.
All right, Alyssa, here's a very timely, boundless map, it looks like.
Yes.
Having to do with plow tracking?
Yes, so in my role at Boundless, I work extensively with the New York City Department of, I'm going to mess up that, but it's Do It.
Do It, it's a technology information
Yes.
department, right?
And this is a map. They have about like 65 like applications or something like this, and this is a map where it shows sort of real-time data of how what are the most recent when your street was plowed last. And so it's updated every 15 minutes, and people serves as a public, communication to let people know in the community when their streets were plowed and when they might expect a plow to come in the future.
And does it work the other way too? Were you able to use this after the snowfalls this winter to identify where plowing was needed, where maybe the plows hadn't been through as recently as people would have hoped?
Well, my understanding is that yes, it was used internally to help prioritize where plowing should go. So, and I don't know if people are aware, but I mean it's a 3-year project that continues to get better and better. It was in response to that original big snowstorm after was it Boxer Day a couple of years ago?
Yeah, Christmas week a few years ago when
Yes.
all the buses got stuck and
Yes.
that kind of thing, right?
Yes, and so I think it's been an ongoing community engagement about how to make this a better public service.
All right, one more from Al Jazeera America. Where would 9 million Syrians fit? Why is that overlaid on a map of New York?
So this fits into a lot of my own personal interest in mapping and the research that I've done in school. So this, when you hear the word numbers 9 million refugees are fleeing Syria, you have no context of what that means. And putting that scale of number into something that people can relate to personally, I think the power of maps the power of seeing it on a map allows you to connect to a world event, or I guess any kind of event, in a deeper way. So if we look at 9 million Syrians and it fits into looking at the demographics of the New York City area, it's in 9 million is all the people.
What are the colors?
I think it's the intensity of the demographics. Do you know?
No, actually, I think they're concentric circles, so it's 2 million, 3 million, and
Yeah.
9 million.
So-
What I actually really
Right,
love
because in other words, the population of the city is about 8 million, so it would be the 5 boroughs plus a little
Exactly.
if you were going to put every Syrian refugee into this area.
Yes. And isn't that incredible?
It is incredible. Right.
So,
I actually really love this map because it's an interactive map, and so it actually lent itself to creating a series of maps curated by all the users, all the viewers of the map. And you can click any place in the United States, and it will draw these concentric circles. So if you're from someplace like Colorado, I could click on Denver, and I could see where that 9 million people currently live in Colorado, in that place that I know. And so it contextualizes the 9 million number for anybody who looks at the map.
And it's perfect for humanizing the Syrians in New York City in particular, because there are about 9 million people in the city. And so it makes you think that everybody I've ever met on the subway or driven past on the road or gone to school with, everybody, that's how many actual human beings are displaced from their homes in Syria. That's the point.
yes.
Tell me about Geo Meetup, Geo NYC Meetup in our last 30 seconds.
All right, so it's April 14th is the next one.
Yes.
It's every second Monday of the month. Anybody's welcome to come. We have a limit. It usually overbooks. People are really excited to get there, but we usually have three speakers, about 10 minutes per talk, covering various subjects and topics.
And the idea is to bring many different kinds. Can I keep going or?
20 seconds, go.
20 seconds. So, mapping is a real center, I think, in New York City, and there's a dialogue that's really evolving in Geo NYC that inspires people to work together, to collaborate, and drive, I think, technological, economic, social, development. So.
For anybody who thinks that technology is a lonely pursuit that you
Yes.
do only in your pajamas, at your desk, on your bed, on your laptop, on your phone, has to do with other people. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And that's our program for today. You'll find a new show here each week at this hour. Next time, the skills gap. Are colleges teaching what corporations want, and should they? And tune into my daily radio program weekdays on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820 at 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.